Hey, this is Joe with EMP CycleWorks. This isn't the bike that I'm using in today's video, but today we are installing the very popular Woods WM8-22xe Cam in a 2022 Roadglide 114. I go through all the steps on how to install a bolt-in cam. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more. Thank you. Today we're working with the Woods WM8-22xe Cam. It's a bolt-in cam with a 470 thousandths lift, and intake closing time at 26 degrees. 212 degrees intake duration and 234 degrees exhaust duration. First thing we're going to do is pop off the pushrod tube covers. And you just use a flathead screwdriver under the lip and pry up, and it pops out. Pretty simple. Here's a closer look. It can be kind of nerve-wracking at first, but once you get it, it's pretty easy. And then we're going to push up on the pushrod tube covers to expose the pushrods underneath. Now I put the bike into 6th gear and remove the spark plugs on the left side, so I can spin the rear wheel and feel the intake pushrod go up and then down. And then once that happens, that's top dead center, and we can remove these pushrods. Since this is a bolt-in cam, we do not need to go into the top end, so we're going to use a set of bolt cutters to cut out the pushrods. I use a set of bolt cutters that are dedicated for doing this, and the reason why we use bolt cutters is so we minimize the amount of metal that goes into the motor. If we use a hacksaw or a cutoff wheel, then we get a lot of metal goes into the lifter cavity here, and we don't want that. So the bolt cutters make a nice clean cut with no excess material being generated here. It's kind of a closer look. It just smashes it and separates it. And I have a rag there to protect the lifter covers, but this is kind of a closer look at what I'm doing here. And you just got to be really careful. It's easy to scratch a bunch of stuff here with these big bolt cutters. So once we get the rear, do the same thing for the front, and now we can take off the cam cover. I'm going to break loose all these bolts by hand, and then just zip them out here with my snap-on 3/8 drive impact gun. And when the gasket's annealed, all you need is a little bit of an impact, so I use a rag and just a slight tap with my dead blow hammer, my rubber dead blow hammer, and it will open up, exposing the cam chest here. Next we need to get rid of the lifters, so I'm going to break the bolts loose with my Allen wrench and then zip them out with my air ratchet here, or excuse me, battery ratchet. The ones in the back require a ball Allen to get out, and you just want to be careful. These are easy to strip out. So now we can break loose the bolts for the cam and the pinion shaft. And because the bike's in 6th gear, I can hold the rear brake and it locks the motor up. So I can break the bolts loose, and then once they're loose, zip them out here with my my snap-on gun again. Once those bolts are gone, I can remove the T27 Torx heads that hold the cam chain tensioner in place. Again, try not to strip these. Then remove the timing set as a whole. Then same deal, break loose the bolts using a ratchet. Just less chance of stripping the bolt head this way. Then once I get them all loose, I'm going to zip out all these bolts for the oil pump and the cam plate. And pull off my Cam Shims. And just take off the whole cam plate as assembly. But it's a 110,000 Shim. And we're going to inspect the cam plate here for the oil pump rides for any wear, and then the pinion bore is for any wear. And I'm going to inspect the cam too, just for anything that might look funny. And with holding the two tabs on the oil pump, I can separate it from the O-ring. And don't forget all the gears and the backing plate. And we're going to reuse these, so you want to go through it and look for any irregularities. This bike, it didn't have many miles on it, so everything was good, but you never know. I've seen 500-mile bikes with metal that went through the oil pump. So just got to make sure everything, you inspect everything. Don't take it for granted that it's new. I want to inspect everything. Get rid of the O-rings here. Don't forget about the oil pump return O-ring. Now this is my setup for measuring the pinion shaft. It's just a adjustable arm for my dial indicator. This is a very useful tool. Fueling makes a good tool I gotta get, but this is what I have. It's what I've always used, so I just keep using it. And then zero your dial indicator, and then spin the rear wheel, and now we have, looks like just shy of 6 thousandths, or maybe 6 thousandths. The indicator's not zeroed, so, but I, with my fingers, push up and down on it at the highest point to see what our total is, and it's about 6 or 7 thousand. So I think we're within Harley spec and good to go. Next is to remove the inner cam bearing, and we have our tool here that goes behind the bearing, so you push it through till it hits a flywheel, and then we stick the shaft in the middle of it, and that will expand the tool to get behind the bearing and give us the ability to pull it out safely. So we stick our plate over the threaded shaft, install our thumb screws here to hold the plate to the case, our washer, and then our nut goes on. And we want to make sure this is good. We want to take our time here, and we're going to start by tightening the nut, and we want to go slowly here. If anything feels funny, we're going to want to stop and reset it up and make sure everything's good. And then once it pops loose, pretty easy. I should have done this when I put this tool on, but I stick a rag on the pinion shaft just in case anything falls. I don't want this big plate to dent that pinion shaft. And there's the old bearing. And the stock bearing has a bearing and races inside the bearing, and the new bearing is a full complement bearing, so its bearings all the way around. You can see that. And then we're always going to press on the letters, the side of the bearing with the letters. So we set up our tool. It's a different shaft that threads through the tool, and then our bearing adapter is threaded onto the shaft. And we're going to wipe out the bore, and I'm using WD-40 as kind of a lubricant to minimize galling on the or prevent galling on the bearing. And letters go down onto the tool because we're pressing onto the letters, and there's reinforcement on the writing side of the bearing, so it allows us to press it in without deforming it. And again, we're going to thread it in by hand and just double check and make sure that the bearing is into the bearing bore evenly, and then we're going to tighten it down. And it should just be even pressure the whole time. Shouldn't have to really yoke on this thing, and then once it stops, it stops. The depth will be set, and you're good to go. Now just remove the tool and double check your work. Bearings installed. Brand new bearing. I'm using some assembly lube on it to make sure it's nice and oiled. And here I'm just checking the fit of these new Woods lifters just to make sure they're good. And I basically stick them in and make sure they slide up and down and rock back and forth very, very, very slightly. So assembly lube on the O-rings just to hold them in. Push in our scavenging O-ring and make sure it's in all the way. Now it's time to install our oil pump. So I'm going to make sure we have our seal on the back of the oil pump. Put the backing plate on, and then use engine oil to lube up the oil pump. This is a 2022, so this oil pump is actually pretty good, way more than enough to feed this Milwaukee 8 and be able to return all the oil that's in the sump back to the oil tank. So the 2020 and up oil pumps are good, especially when you have 6 or 7 thousandths run out in the crank. You don't want to use an SNS or a fueling pump with that much run out. And I'm going to fill up the oil pump gears with the oil, and then we got to time the oil pump gear with the flats on the pinion shaft. And just spin it around and it'll slide in once you get it. And then you have to make sure you get the oil pump to index into the sump O-ring very cleanly. So more engine oil. Then we're going to put our feed gear in. And again, we're going to have to time that inner gear with the pinion shaft. And it's just a matter of spinning it and installing it. And then just more oil. Make sure everything is nice and lubed. The more oil you can get in here, the faster the lifters will prime. Assembly lube on our brand new cam that's cleaned. It comes with a like an anti-corrosion film on there. You got to get that off before you install it. So it's nice and clean. Assembly lube. Make sure it spins in the bearing nicely. And I put assembly lube where the cam rides in the cam plate, and engine oil where the oil pump rides. Now we're going to install our cam plate. And there's a locating dowel, so it'll snap in and kind of be located, but we still need to center everything. So blue Loctite on the bolts, cam plate, and I use blue Loctite on these factory oil pumps as well. I know Fueling doesn't want you to use Loctite on their pumps, but I don't want any of these bolts to come out, and I feel like just a little bit of Loctite's not going to mess with any of the tolerances, so I use it. Now I'm going to hand tighten the cam plate bolts just so they touch, and then spin the rear wheel again a few times, just spin the pinion shaft, and what I'm doing is trying to center the cam plate to the pinion shaft. And now I'm going to torque the bolts to 120 inch-pounds, spin the wheel again, or spin the pinion again, and now I'm going to hand tighten just so they touch the oil pump bolts. And the oil pump I'm going to do in 3 steps. So that's step 1, hand tight, spin it. And then 60 inch-pounds I do in a crisscross pattern. Spin the rear wheel again. And I'm feeling for any kind of binding or anything that's changing here as I'm doing this. And then a final torque of 120 inch-pounds in a crisscross pattern. And then once I do that, I go around and just double check and make sure I have torque on every single one of these bolts. And then spin the wheel again, this time basically just feeling for any kind of binding. Now time to measure for our cam shims. We're going to put the 110,000 shim that came on the bike in the pinion and the cam gear. And I got to line up the dots here to stick my tool in to lock these together. I have a little tool that once these things are timed at top dead, you can lock the 2 gears together, allowing you to torque the bolts. Because I don't have the chain on, I can't use the rear wheel or the rear brake. It would work for the pinion, but not the cam. So I'm just going to install the bolts, torque them to 25 foot-pounds. Both the pinion and the crank, or the pinion and the cam gear. Remove my tool. Now I'm going to take a straight edge and see how in line these 2 gears are. So we want under 8 thousandths of a difference between the cam and the pinion gear. And in this case, I actually have 8 thousandths. My 8 thousandths feeler gauge went in. So next step up is 18 thousandths I'm going to do. And if that doesn't go, that pretty much means that we need a 10 thousandths shim to get under our 8 thousandths of difference here. So that one was 18. So I pull off the gears, pull off our shim. 110 thousandths is this shim. Barely see it there. Sorry, I tried to make it. And we're going to put in 120. And torque the gears. Same thing. Now we have our 8 thousandths, and it will not go in. And just looking at this, it's very, very tight. So the shims only come in 10,000 increments, so as long as we're within 8,000 of either way, we're good. And our 8,000s wouldn't fit in, so we have less than 8,000s clearance. So now we time our gears together with lining up the dots on the cam chain with the cam chain installed, and then install that whole timing assembly onto the motor. And then double check that our dots line up. I'm spinning the rear wheel just to line up in the center. Very, very important. That's the whole timing. That's all you have to do to time it. Take some time and make sure it's right. So red Loctite on just the tip of the threads, and then I use engine oil on the bolt and the washer for both the cam and the pinion bolts here. And the Loctite is going to hold it in place, and the oil is there to make sure we're not getting any dragging when we torque these. So we want to make sure we have accurate torque. So what we're doing is 25 foot-pounds on both the pinion and the cam. Break them loose, back them off about a full turn. And then we're going to do our final torque of 25 foot-pounds on the pinion and then 35 foot-pounds on the cam. And so nice to be able to hold the rear brake to do this. The tool's kind of a pain to get in there, so this is a nice way to do it. And once that's done, once those bolts are torqued, I'm going to lube up the cam chain so it never runs dry. Spin the wheel, let's get some nice lube on there. And now blue Loctite on our tensioner bolts. And I install these by hand. A lot of times I'll start them with my hand and then zip them in with a battery gun. But they only get 10 foot-pounds, so you want to be really careful with these because they're T27 Torx and very easy to strip. You don't want to damage these bolts. So 120 inch-pounds, and our cam chest is just about wrapped up. All we got to do is put the cover on, blue Loctite on the bolts, get our gasket on, only goes on one way, and then I usually use 2 bolts through the cover, through the gasket, and that just holds the gasket in place. So once those 2 bolts are on, I can put the cover on and just start the bolts. And once those 2 are started, I'll put the rest of the bolts in, spin them in by hand, and then 120 inch-pounds of torque. Sorry, I didn't record that for some reason. New lifters, putting oil on the rollers, and then I'm going to take this as a fueling oil can, and you can use it and fill the oil hole with oil until engine oil starts coming out of the top of the lifter. It's not perfect, but it aids in bleeding. So install the lifters, and these lifters go on a Milwaukee 8. The oil holes face each other, so the intake's going to face out and the exhaust is going to face in. And same with the front and the rear. Lube up the lifters, and it's not perfect. I've been wanting one of those Shim's vacuum systems to bleed the lifters, but they're on back order, like everything from Shim's right at the moment. So we got our S&S lifter cup, so I'm going to use some blue Loctite on the bolts, install the lifter cuff, and then I take a 1.5 feeler gauge in between the lifter and the lifter cuff, and what I'm looking to do is center the lifter cuff as much as I can on the lifters, and that'll just aid in, or that'll just limit the amount of friction that we have there. Cups are supposed to stabilize the lifters at high speed and high lift, and I'll spin the motor once everything's done, and the lifter should go up and down without being held in at all. So now I'll put the bike back in neutral and turn the key on and hit the starter button and spin the motor over a couple times until I start seeing oil come out of the lifters. That means your whole bottom end is bled, the lifters are full of oil, and we can put the push rods in. That step will pretty much eliminate any lifter noise that you're going to have on the first startup with new lifters. So it probably also aid just the longevity of the motor, since the lifters are plenty of oil in them. So install the gaskets and the lifter covers. Same deal, blue Loctite on the bolts, and these get torqued to 120 inch-pounds. Now the outer ones I can use my torque wrench on, but the inner ones, because of the cylinders, you're not going to be able to get a torque wrench. At least I can't get my torque wrench in there. So what I do is I use my Allen wrench and I put it on a bolt that I've already torqued and feel how tight it is, and then kind of use that as a gauge to do the inner ones. Definitely not by the book, but 120 inch-pounds is pretty easy to feel, and it's fair to say that I'm fairly close, within probably 20 inch-pounds of the mark here. And I've never had a problem, and this is how I've always really done it. If I have access, I'll use a torque wrench, but in this case, there's no access. So O-rings get installed in the lifter blocks and then the cylinder heads. And we just want to make sure we're not doubling up any of these O-rings. We want to make sure the ones that were in there, the old ones are gone, and the new ones are installed by themselves. And I usually install lifter cover O-rings dry. Seems to prevent leaks that way. So here's our S&S push rods, and they work. They're quickie push rods because there's a whole probably 2 inches there before the threads start, and that will go all the way up into the push rod, so we can collapse it enough to get it in. And then once we get our adjustment, we tighten the lock nut down and it's locked in. So on these push rod tubes, they come with everything you need except for the spring and the washer, and the washer is on the push rod tubes when they come in. Or basically it's just the spring. So how this goes is we take the push rod tube, put the collar, put a spring, put a washer, and then the O-ring. And then the bottom push rod tube cover goes on. Step side goes away from the collar that we put on. Now I'm spinning the rear wheel to get the cylinder I'm working on, the top dead center compression, and I'll do that by feeling the intake lifter go up and then come down, same way we did when we took it apart. I mean, when that happens, we're ready to install. I'm going to blow air through these push rods and then visually look through them. The machine parts, they can have machining debris in them, and sometimes they can be completely clogged. So we want to make sure that's not the case. And the push rod goes through the tube, and you kind of want to hold the lock nut with your thumb or your finger while you're holding the push rod, because if that falls down, it's kind of a pain to get. Not impossible, it won't come off the push rod, but if it goes down to the lifter bore here, it's you got to get a magnet or something to fish it out of there. So we're gonna extend the push rod until it comes in contact with the lifter, and then there's no up and down movement, just with our fingers. So that's called zero lash, and that's the starting point of our adjustment. And here I dropped the nut down in the push rod tube, so I had to get my my little magnet to grab it. So there's not a lot of room here, so stuff like that happens. Just gotta be ready for it. Now, no up and down movement is zero lash, and I use the lower push rod to adjust it, and there are 4 sides to it, and they're 1/4 inch. So we want to go 4 complete turns because they're 32 threads per inch, and then it'll give us about 100 thousandths of into the push rod travel. So that's 16 flats, because there's 4 flats to a side, 2 complete turns. Now we're going to lock our lock nut up to the top of the push rod tube, the upper part of the push rod, and I use kind of like a scissor motion here. Put my wrenches so I can like scissor them together, and this aids in getting a decent amount of torque. Also makes it really hard for these things to slip off. If it slips off, you can hit your knuckles or damage the bolt. So, and how we put the push rod tube covers on, same way we took them off, only this time we put pressure down on the collar and the spring, and then wedge the upper cover into place. and we're done.